Management games are a weird genre if you think about it. It's the type of stuff you typically do as a job, but with a layer of abstraction and gamification behind it that often succeeds in making otherwise mundane aspects of those jobs more interesting. I mean, I wouldn't want to be a border patrol guard of an authoritarian regime, but Papers, Please managed to make that a riveting drama unfolding before your very eyes, while you're still doing all the quote-unquote boring border patrol stuff like checking documents and permits and observing an ever-changing roulette of rules that guide your judgments. Often, these management games focus on recreating an aspect of reality, be it simulating theme parks or restaurants, for example. It's interesting how video games can both cater to people who want to go on grand fantastical adventures in far future scenarios and high fantasy kingdoms, and people who want to sit down and crunch some numbers to boost their returns on investments. So it was inevitable for someone to make a fantasy JRPG where you're not tasked with killing God with the power of friendship for once, but instead run the item shop. Recettear is a cute little fantasy game about the harsh realities of loan sharking. It stars Recettear, a girl whose absent father took up a loan that he hasn't paid back yet. Because of that, Tyr, a fairy sent by the company that lent Recettear's father the money, shows up at her doorstep and demands incremental payments to clear her father's debt over a span of 5 weeks. And that's basically all the setup we get. Recettear has money trouble and decides to turn her home into a store to sell a variety of items to fellow townsfolk as well as adventurers who frequent the town. I like this role reversal. Typically in fantasy RPGs, you're the person visiting these towns and are either restocking on gears and consumables or selling off unwanted garbage that these store owners always love to buy off of you. It's also uncommon for players to pay great attention to the NPCs in these establishments, since they're just there to dispense the items you want and helplessly buy all the stuff you don't want. So it's a great idea to show these dynamics from the other perspective for once. In terms of gameplay, it's mostly straightforward. To run your shop, you first have to acquire a bunch of inventory. You have multiple ways of procuring said stock, either from a market, the Merchants Guild, or by sending off adventurers and tasking them with bringing back items or ingredients to craft better items. The first two are rather self-explanatory. They're a bunch of dolled up menus that show you what's on offer so you can buy it as stock to sell later on. We'll ignore why the townsfolk come to buy that stuff from you at a markup when they could just go to the market for half the stuff that's on offer in this game. The adventuring portion is a bit more involved though. You can recruit a couple of adventurers over the course of the game to go into half a dozen dungeons to retrieve ingredients and gear. But the twist here is that it's not just a passive affair. You get to go along into those dungeons, and the game hands you control over the adventurers you've hired to engage in some light combat gameplay while wandering around randomly generated dungeons. I'll be honest here, the dungeon crawling aspect didn't really resonate with me all that much. It's too simplistic to be entertaining, and it also unnecessarily detracts from the other half of the game. I mean, it's right there in the title, it's an item shop's tale. I feel the inclusion of the playable dungeons detracts from the central idea the game is built upon. It almost feels as if the developers were afraid to fully commit to a simple management game and felt pressured to come up with this other half of the game out of some misguided sense of variety. And the reason I say that is because of the very simplistic nature of the dungeon crawling that can be found here. It's literally just a bunch of tacked together combat spaces filled with a random assortment of enemies that mostly exhibit the same behaviors and aren't tough to deal with. Not that that would even be possible, since the combat mechanics are about as simple as they get. The uninteresting dungeon crawling coupled with the tacit betrayal of the game's central gimmick left me with a general unwillingness to engage with that aspect of the game all that much. And since that part of the game is also the one that nets you all the ingredients for the crafting system, I also never engaged with that in any meaningful capacity either. Now that might sound like me just not doing my homework and talking out of my ass in this review, but here's the punchline, boys and girls. I never needed to. The game can be beaten without ever engaging in any of these aspects whatsoever. I guess this is something that the game has in common with a lot of other aggressively Japanese games, especially JRPGs. It's this insistence of implementing a million systems of engagement that all contribute fuck all to the final experience and only add a layer of meaningless grind, mostly there for the 100 completion nutters who derive enjoyment from even the most menial checklists these games have to offer. Anyway, once you have a bunch of stuff to sell, you can return to your store, put the items on your shelves, and watch customers flock in to see the wares on offer. If a customer shows interest in a product, you get to haggle over the price until they're happy with it, or they eventually refuse to buy from you for not meeting their budget. As I've mentioned before, the point of stores in games isn't just to sell stuff, but also buy items from people that they don't want. And that aspect is also represented in Recettear. Your customers sometimes show up with stuff they don't need, which you can buy from them. Often this is used to throw you a curveball, since, at least in my experience, they tend to show up with a ton of expensive stuff, especially early in the game, that can quickly deplete your finances. And it's also intended to break your experience streak. As I said before, Japanese games have a tendency to systematize a lot of their gameplay. And while haggling over the price is a central mechanic that gets extensively tutorialized at the start, it's actually counterintuitively not what you're supposed to do. The game tells you that typically a sale price of 30% above the base price is acceptable to most customers. And when I first started playing, I aggressively targeted that price point but never got anywhere with my character's merchant level, since you get bonus experience points from sales where you hit an agreeable price point without having to haggle first. Because of course Recettear has a merchant level, this is an RPG after all, and you need some kind of progression that determines what types of items you can get from the market and merchant's guild. This initial quote-unquote strategy ended with me missing one of the payment milestones by quite a margin. At that point, the game actually sent me back all the way to day 2 of the calendar to try again, so it has somewhat of a roguelike quality, even though you can manually save at any point and just load up that save to continue where you left off previously. But here's actually where the game took a turn for the interesting. Because even though all my money was gone, my inventory, merchant level, dungeon progress, etc. was all still there. So while the game is content with letting you screw yourself over royally the first time around, you basically don't get punished that hard for failing at it. And the fact that you get to keep everything except the money means that you're now much better equipped to deal with the upcoming challenges. I also did end up figuring out a winning strategy eventually by not aiming for that 30% profit margin and instead always going for a mere 10%. That way you almost never have to haggle, which quickly increased my levels to the point where I could buy a lot more expensive items and expand my shop. The game also introduces market fluctuations that affect the prices of your items. If prices sink, you'll generally have to sell your items way below their base price. If my typical sales were at around 110% of the price, these cheaper items usually sold for 55%. A way to get around that is by simply not stocking these items. Characters typically only buy what's on the shelves. Sometimes they come up to you and ask you for an item in a specific category, so if you have something there, you can choose which items you want to sell. For these discounted items, I usually went with cheaper ones so that selling them wouldn't eat into my profits. Conversely, there are also times when items can be sold for much more, which predictably ended up being around 220% or twice as much as you could usually demand. These scarcities led to a few in-game days where I had such massive profits that I had the necessary funds to pay back the loan almost a week in advance. Now this might not sound all that impressive, but the weekly payments increased at an almost exponential level, from a mere 10,000 at the start to $500,000 by the end. Unfortunately, there's no way to then just jump ahead to the end of the game. You have to run out the clock by artificially moving around town a bit. Going to a place in town and returning to the store moves the clock forward, so the final stretch of the game for me was a couple of minutes of busy work. There's no downside to not selling anything, since you have no fixed cost payments beyond those due dates for your loan, which seems like a bit of an oversight. And I admit that by the end I kinda got a bit tired of the sale mechanics, because at that point I figured out the behaviors of the characters and consistently managed to pull in way more money than necessary. The gameplay never really changes while you're in the store. And yeah, I can hear you yelling, that's what the dungeons and crafting are for, but they were also equally underwhelming, so it's trading in one gameplay aspect for another that isn't all that fulfilling and didn't really seem to accelerate my financial growth anyway. Because if it did, speedrunners wouldn't also completely ignore it after all. Now here's where a theme or a relevant storyline could have helped the game sustain my interest for a bit longer. The game starts off strong with the idea of a little girl being coerced into paying her father's debts by the fantasy equivalent of a loan shark. And there are a few jabs at typical fantasy game tropes thrown in there for good measure, like the quite frankly ludicrous prices certain items fetch in relation to others. But I just feel that most of that is fairly superficial and leaves a lot of unfulfilled potential on the table. I mean, Recettear herself adopts a catchphrase, capitalism ho. That would have been an excellent angle to tackle a story from. Make it a critique of capitalism. Make it about the struggle of being forced to work in a society that seems to be mostly centered around consumption. But no, as it stands, the game doesn't really tell a story. It introduces a sort of antagonist partway through with Alouette, who runs an apparently competing business, but it never really materializes into an actual rivalry, and it has no impact on your ability to sell to guaranteed customers. All that happens is that she and her fairy show up periodically at your store to buy something. The twist is that those two are the ones who will never accept anything above base price, so they're really just reduced to simple to navigate obstacles. In the end, I'm not sure if I can recommend Recettear. I mean, I'd be lying if I were saying that I did didn't have fun with the core item shop mechanic. It has this addictive quality to it, especially in the period when you're still trying to figure out the systems. But once you do, it becomes pretty rote, and the systemic nature of the gameplay becomes fairly evident. You could probably recreate a similar game in Excel just without the graphics in an afternoon or two. And I guess this too is a fairly common aspect of Japanese games, that they end up playing more like a graphical user interface overlaid on a spreadsheet. But ultimately, that's not the primary reason why I wouldn't recommend it. To me, it's not that what I ended up playing wasn't a masterpiece, but more that I saw so much more potential in this idea that didn't get realized. A bad game is one thing, but I feel it's all the more tragic if you play a sort of passable game that's clearly standing in the shadow of the much better game it could be.